All right, gang. So here is just a little video I'm going to do on Reagan, just in case we don't get to it, or in case you're absent or something, and you want, or in case we go through it really fast and you want to go back to it. But this PowerPoint is not the one that I usually use. I mean, I've used this before, but the textbook type that I normally use, if you want to go through that one, it's chapter 39. But this is just another one that I think it has better visuals, so I'm just going to go through this kind of quickly. But basically, what we need to know about Reagan is, there shouldn't be a lot of questions post 1980 at all. There should not be any writing after 1980. But you might get something on like the rise of conservatism and why Reagan was so appealing and why he won the election of 1980 by such a landslide. So if you remember, in the 70s, there was a terrible situation of what we call stagflation, which is like stagnant inflation. There's really high unemployment. I think the unemployment rate was around 7 or 8%, and interest rates were really high, and people were just getting really disgusted with that. The government was spending so much money in the 70s, in the early 70s, on the Vietnam War, and then later, since the 60s and the war on poverty and the Great Society, they were spending a lot of money on these social welfare programs, and you could even take it as back as far as the New Deal, I told you, made the government bigger and more in touch with people's lives, like personally invested in people's welfare. And a lot of programs that were created have been sustained since then, and it's very costly. So then you add on to that the Great Society in the 60s, and the government has become really big, and all these social welfare programs are very expensive, and Reagan is not a fan of social welfare programs at all. He is not a fan of big government at all. He wants to reduce the size of the government. He said, government is not our solution, government is our problem. So he wants to cut down the size of government. What he says too when he's campaigning is, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago, which is really an attack on Jimmy Carter. And basically, a lot of Americans are sitting there scratching their heads and thinking financially, gosh, no, I'm not. Maybe you've lost your job. Inflation is when the cost of goods and products and services go up, and your wages aren't. So it's a stagnant situation that way. So we call it stagflation. So that's a problem, and that's through Nixon. That starts with Nixon, Ford, and then Carter. You have that situation. So it's very problematic. People feel also too like the government has been lying to them. We talked about Vietnam, how they felt like the whole thing with the Pentagon Papers, and the government was keeping things from the public, and so many people died in the war. They felt it was senseless. So people have distrust there. Then you have the Watergate scandal, and Nixon, and then Nixon resigns, and Nixon, Watergate, and then Ford pardons him, and then people are like, "Oh, everybody's a crook, and he's in on it too." That wasn't the case. Ford really just did that because he felt the country just needed to heal and move on. He certainly wasn't covering anything up for Nixon. But anyway, that's what people felt. They were like, geez, this government is like, what's going on? So they were looking for somebody fresh and somebody new, and somebody who wasn't, Reagan wasn't involved in the Vietnam War with that. He wasn't, he didn't have his hand in that. So he was somebody new, who was different. And he had a good reputation from being, he was governor in California. Previously, he had been an actor, actually, which is a different kind of a path for a president to take. But he was born in Illinois, and he grew up very hardworking guy. His father was a really bad alcoholic, and I think the dad might have died young. And Ronald Reagan was always working and trying to get ahead. And he went to college and he played sports, and he was just like an all-American kind of guy, very patriotic, very loyal to the country, very, very staunch anti-communist. When he was in the Screen Actors Guild, when he was an actor, he was actually the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he was very adamant about anti-communism. And if you remember, in the McCarthy era in the 50s, when Ronald Reagan was popular as an actor, when he was a young actor, he being communist was a terrible thing for an actor, because you get on that list of McCarthy's and it could ruin your career. So he was staunchly anti-Republican. He is a Republican, anti-communist, and a Republican, and he stays that way. And he becomes very interested in politics through being in the Screen Actors Guild, and he goes on to make a career of it, and eventually leaves acting and enters politics in the state of California. Okay, so Reagan is very much on the right. When he runs for president, there is this like movement in the 80s of what we call the new right. So this is people who were far over here, and you had in the 60s and the 70s a lot of push for the individual. You saw things like Roe v. Wade in 1972, which is the abortion case. You saw things like the Miranda case, which is the rights of the accused. So you had a lot of stuff that pleased people over here, but now people over here are kind of like, oh, we don't know if we like all of that stuff. We want to get back to what they consider to be traditional family values, okay? And it's not going to be, you're not going to find staunch feminists over here. You're not going to find people who maybe aren't over here. You're going to find almost fundamentalists, like people who are very Christian, and they don't like maybe some of the freedoms that they see going on in the world that were perpetrated in the 60s and 70s. Okay, one of the big things here, this deregulation of the economy, is important because like what's this? Because can I write with that? No, sorry. Anyway, because okay, deregulation of the economy. So basically, there were so many regulations. Actually, the EPA was formed. The Environmental Protection Agency was formed under Richard Nixon. So you can imagine, girls, with that, all the stuff that comes for a business owner. So all of a sudden, like, and this is just being like very basic, okay, with this example, but like if you owned a factory in like before the EPA was formed in the 70s, you were probably dumping the waste from your factory into local streams. You were probably just discarding things wherever. You were probably emitting all kinds of pollutants into the air, and nobody said boo about it. Once the EPA was created, there were all these regulations. And I'm not saying Ronald Reagan wanted to ruin the environment or anything like that, but he just felt like, gosh, there's so many, the government is so big and so involved with all these agencies telling people you have to do this that way and you have to do that way, that it was becoming very costly to do business. And Reagan's theory is, if I can deregulate the economy, if I can take some, you can't take away some of the environmental stuff, but if I can take away some of these rules and regulations that they have on big business, then maybe they can instead of spending money on all of those things that they have to do, those extra steps, maybe then they could spend the money on making their business bigger, and they can therefore hire more people. So it's a little bit of a trickle down economics. Sometimes it's called supply side economics. So if you make it so that the business can spend more money on business instead of other stuff, the theory is that it will trickle down to people and equal more jobs. That's not always how it works, but that is what the hope is, okay? And sometimes they call it Reaganomics, because Reagan was such a big believer in this and so much wanted that to happen. And so that's something that he was trying to do. So he wants to make government smaller. That's his big goal: make government smaller, and make it easier for business to do business. Okay, and have we seen that before? Yes. Okay, we've totally seen that before. Whenever we talk about a laissez-faire president, that cartoon we talked about with Calvin Coolidge playing the saxophone, totally would be a connection you could make to Reagan. Reagan was a big fan of big business, and he totally didn't want to interfere. When you say you want to deregulate, that means you want to sit there and play the saxophone so they can just do what they want. You don't want to put a bunch of rules and regulations and penalties on businesses. You just want them to hum along and do their business thing. And that's what Reagan would have wanted, okay? He also wants to cut taxes, which people always want to hear. He wants to cut taxes by like up to 25% over the course of 3 years. So he also felt if individuals had had less taxes, they would have more money to spend, and that would stimulate the economy. Okay. All right. So he wants to do all this. Okay. And so guys, here's what we mean here. So you know the whole thing with the counterculture movement in the 60s with people questioning government and protesting the government. Like he wants to get away from that. And he's more of a patriotic person where, sorry, he wants to just, you support your government and that's it. Okay. All right, so, and girls, this is what we mean by entitlement programs. I'm sorry, I keep clicking the wrong thing here. What we mean by entitlement programs is like welfare type programs. And I don't mean welfare like, oh, you are getting a welfare check. I mean welfare for the welfare of the country. So whether it's Medicaid, Medicare, whether it is welfare, whether it's food stamps, whether it's Social Security, whatever, that is an entitlement program. People are entitled to get that thing. Okay, so they are nearly about $300 billion a year by 1980 with all the stuff. Like I said, if you go back to the New Deal, if you go back to the Great Society, the War on Poverty, all the programs, Medicaid, Medicare, all the stuff that was done is causing a tremendous amount of money to be spent. The Vietnam War caused a tremendous amount of money to be spent. Okay, so now we're spending all this money. Of course, we're still not spending money on the Vietnam War, but we are still spending those social welfare programs. Sorry, don't go away. And when he says he wants to promote family values and patriotic ideals, by family values, guys, these people who are on the far right, conservative people, are going to mean what they think is a family, right? Okay. So during this time, 1970 was the first gay pride parade. There is a movement for gay rights, certainly, in this time in the country. And those who are on the far right are going to question that, and they want to get back to what they consider to be more of a traditional family. There's also an epidemic of AIDS during this time period, the disease AIDS, which was had, for those people on the far right, had a stigma of being a disease that struck, homosexual men. So there was like a stigma with that, and a lot of people who criticize Reagan say he didn't do enough for the AIDS epidemic because of the fact that of the position of the far right, that it was a disease afflicting it really was afflicting more than it was. Drug users got it, and people who were in the hospital, people who were hemophiliacs who got blood transfusions frequently could get it. So anybody could get it. To say it was just the disease, but predominantly, if you look at the numbers, the first instances of it were of gay men, and a majority were, but critics of Reagan will say, you could have done more with funding and research and what have you, but people felt he avoided it because of the bulk of the people that inflict it, okay, because he would lose the far right. That's what people thought, okay. So there's that whole situation. What else did these people, the more fundamental people on the right, would want? Prayer in public school, which is not going to happen ever because of separation of church and state, but they did push for that. They also pushed for the reversal of Roe v. Wade, which is the abortion case that was decided in 1972 that made abortion legal in this country. Some people on the a lot of people on the far right had a problem with that. Let's see here. I just want to see how much time we have. Oh boy, we're almost done. We're gonna have to do another one. I'm just gonna leave this like this. So what came out of this, guys? What's this here? Oh, he wants to stimulate business. We already said that. By reducing regulations and lowering taxes and strengthen our defense. Reagan is going to spend a tremendous amount of money on the defense system because it's the Cold War, right? We're trying to compete with an arms race with the Soviet Union, but he puts a lot of money into that. You see a rise of what they call sorry, that looks crazy, the moral majority during this. This guy, Jerry Falwell, who was a TV evangelist, he's a fundamental Christian on the far right. He is going to start a group that's called the Moral Majority, and he is very anti-homosexual, anti-feminism, all that stuff. He's very far on the other side. Okay, so I'm going to stop this thing and then pick it up here, talk more about the new right. Okay, so there'll have to be a second recording as well.